Have you ever met someone so intense, so fearless, so uncontrollable that even the strongest men stepped aside when they entered the room? In professional wrestling, that man was Scott Steiner. But behind the muscles and madness was a ticking time bomb that made enemies in the ring and absolute chaos behind the scenes. This isn't just about wrestling. This is about fear, betrayal, power, and the one man no one dared cross. But what happens when that man chooses to fight everyone? Scott Steiner didn't just play a tough guy on TV, he was the storm. In the early 90s, when most wrestlers followed orders to keep their spot, Steiner was the rare voice who didn't care about politics. When Bill Watts took over WCW and started slashing paychecks while handing his own son an undeserved push, most kept quiet, but not Steiner. He confronted Watts head-on, in front of the entire locker room. He called him out, cursed him out, and shook him so badly that Watts began carrying a loaded gun to work, terrified of what Scott might do next. Steiner's rage wasn't limited to the boss. Even legends weren't safe. Ric Flair, the Nature Boy, the 16-time world champion, learned that the hard way. Behind the charisma and gold robes, Steiner saw a manipulator. "Flair will smile at you and stab you in the back," he said. And then, in front of live television cameras, Steiner did the unthinkable. He exposed Flair's secrets in a shoot promo that left the wrestling world stunned. Flair, the symbol of CW, was mocked, insulted, and broken down on live TV. Steiner called him a washed-up coward, clinging to power and teeth he never fixed. The crowd gasped, the locker room froze. Flair cried in his dressing room, and WCW suspended Steiner, but paid him during it. They didn't punish him, not really, because they were scared too. Steiner had become untouchable and more dangerous than ever. But Steiner wasn't done. Another name would soon join his list. Terry Taylor, the man once known as the Red Rooster, now a Backstage official. Depending on the version you believe, either Taylor gave Steiner bad news about a match or accidentally disrespected him. Either way, the result was pure chaos. Steiner stormed the production area, screamed in Taylor's face, and forced WCW to delay their TV taping for nearly an hour. And this was just the beginning. By 2000, WCW was crumbling. Tensions were high, egos clashed, and Scott Steiner was ready to explode again. This time, his target was Diamond Dallas Page, better known as DDP. Page was a former world champion who had seemingly earned his success through grit and determination. But Steiner saw something else, a man backed by friends in high places, especially Eric Bischoff. That didn't sit well with the self-proclaimed genetic freak. Then came the real spark. DDP's wife, Kimberly, reported a stash of drugs she found backstage. Steiner's friend, Tammy Sitch, was fired. That betrayal was enough to send him over the edge. He chased Kimberly out of the building. Then, on live television, he cut a vicious promo, calling her out by name. It was no longer just wrestling, it was war. The fight between Steiner and DDP exploded backstage. Accounts differ, but one thing's clear. Steiner tried to gouge DDP's eyes out. It took several wrestlers to separate them. But once again, WCW refused to punish Steiner. Fear had become his greatest weapon. And still, Steiner wasn't finished. As the Monday Night Wars came to a brutal end, he looked ahead and saw a new enemy rising. One even more powerful. One that had crushed WCW from the inside. One whose name echoed like poison in Scott Steiner's mind. What happens when an unstoppable force meets a self-proclaimed immortal man? In the world of wrestling, it wasn't just a match. It was a backstage war that never truly ended. After leaving a trail of chaos in WCW, Scott Steiner had his eyes set on one man, a man he believed had poisoned the business from within, Hulk Hogan. And once Scott decided you were the enemy, there was no escape. It all started in 1998 when Steiner betrayed his own brother at Super Brawl and joined the NWO. It was the perfect heel turn, a rebirth. Big Poppa Pump was born. Fans expected a monster push. But then something strange happened. In his very next match against Lex Luger, Steiner lost. The hype died down, the momentum faded, and behind the scenes, Steiner found out why. According to Sting, it was Hogan who pulled the strings. Hogan didn't want Steiner rising too fast. He didn't want anyone threatening his spot. Steiner never forgot. He believed that match loss was no coincidence. It was sabotage. And worse, it wasn't the only time Hogan manipulated outcomes behind the curtain. Scott began to see a pattern. Hogan would arrive late to shows, stall production until finishes were rewritten to his liking, and override bookers. He was a backstage politician with enough power to bury anyone. Steiner wasn't the only one who noticed, but he was the only one willing to confront it head-on. In his eyes, Hogan wasn't a legend. He was a fraud, a poison, and worse, a coward hiding behind power. When WCW finally collapsed, Steiner knew exactly who to blame. Hogan killed WCW, he said, without hesitation. And when Hogan reappeared in TNA alongside Eric Bischoff, Steiner knew the nightmare was repeating itself. He marched straight into Dixie Carter's office and warned her, "These guys will ruin this company." She didn't listen. True to Steiner's prediction, TNA's golden era began to wither. Creative decisions turned bizarre. Promising stars were overshadowed. Morale dropped. Steiner watched it all unfold, seething with rage. And when TNA finally let him go in 2012, he unleashed a hurricane of fury online. His Twitter feed turned into a war zone of expletives, calling out Hogan, Bischoff, and everyone responsible for what he saw as another wrestling empire destroyed by greed. But the darkest chapter of this feud wasn't in the ring, or even backstage. It happened in public, at an airport, just after WrestleMania 31. Scott spotted Hogan's wife, Jennifer, and approached her. He didn't scream. He didn't touch her. He simply spoke his mind, telling her what he thought of her husband. Then he walked away. No violence, no threats, just words. But those words sparked a storm. Jennifer called Hogan. Hogan called the police. And suddenly, Scott Steiner was being investigated for terroristic threats and aggravated assault. If there hadn't been cameras at the airport, Steiner could have gone to prison for 15 years. It was only thanks to footage that proved his innocence that the case was dropped. But it proved one thing: this feud had crossed a line. This was no longer about wrestling. It was personal. Even in 2025, the bitterness still burns. In a recent interview, Steiner held nothing back. He ripped into Hogan again, this time over the leaked audio of Hogan's racist comments. "That's who he really is," Steiner claimed. "The fans are finally seeing it." For him, Hogan was never the hero the world believed. He was a manipulator, a liar, and a man who nearly destroyed wrestling twice. And yet, despite everything, the suspensions, the fights, the blacklisting, Steiner survived. He never bowed to power, never played the political game. And in a business where everyone wears a mask, Steiner became infamous for ripping them off. But the story doesn't end there, because when Scott Steiner returned to WWE in 2002, fans hoped for redemption, for the Warrior to finally get his crown. But what they got was another battle, one that nearly broke him. What if the final mountain you climb turns out to be a trap? After decades of battles, betrayals, and broken promises, Scott Steiner thought he was ready for one last run. WWE, the biggest stage of all, came calling in 2002. The fans roared, the lights were bright, and the crowd believed the genetic freak had finally arrived at the top. But what followed wasn't a coronation, it was a setup, a slow, painful takedown hidden behind smiles and spotlights. From the moment Steiner stepped into WWE, the company treated him like a star. Vignettes aired weekly. His return at Survivor Series was electric. He flattened Matt Hardy and Chris Nowinski with ease, and the fans went wild. But behind the curtain, something sinister was brewing. His push wasn't about glory, it was about containment. Enter Triple H, WWE's golden boy, its top heel, and more importantly, the boss's future son-in-law. This was the Reign of Terror era, where every challenger was made to look weak, and Triple H came out looking stronger than ever. Steiner, despite his reputation, despite the crowd's cheers, was thrown into a feud not built on combat, but on humiliation. Instead of a brutal war, fans got arm wrestling contests, pose-downs, flex-offs, boring, drawn-out segments that drained all the fire from the feud. The audience knew something was wrong. Steiner wasn't being pushed, he was being mocked, a powerhouse being used as a prop. The man who once made legends cry was now stuck in scripted segments that even the commentators couldn't defend. And when it came time to actually wrestle, the mismatch was obvious. Steiner, who had suffered major injuries before his return, wasn't in peak form. Triple H exploited it. Their matches were clunky, awkward, and loaded with overbooking. It became clear Steiner had been set up to fail. And worse, he was expected to be grateful for it. In private interviews later, Steiner revealed what he truly believed was happening. Triple H wasn't just defending a title, he was defending his political throne. "When you're banging the boss's daughter," Steiner said with a sneer, "you can beat anybody," and beat everybody he did, especially anyone who once wore WCW colors. To Steiner, this wasn't just personal, it was systematic. WCW alumni were treated like dirt. Booker T, DDP, Goldberg, all fed to the machine. WWE didn't just want to win the war, they wanted to erase the legacy of anyone who stood on the other side. And for a man who had fought tooth and nail to carve his place in history, that was unforgivable. And yet, even as he was pushed down, Steiner never stopped fighting. He stayed loud, he stayed dangerous, and he kept speaking his truth, even when it cost him opportunities, even when it made him the villain to corporate eyes. Because for all his faults, Steiner was always real, in a business of masks and manipulation that made him a threat. Years passed, careers faded, but Steiner never let go of the grudges that shaped him. Hogan, Flair, Triple H, they became more than enemies. They became symbols of everything he hated about the industry, the corruption, the politics, the lies. And he never apologized for any of it. Even now in interviews, Steiner's fire hasn't dimmed. He still calls out the fakes, still questions the legends, still refuses to play nice. Because to him, respect isn't earned through titles or TV time, it's earned through honesty, through grit, through fearlessness. But one incident nearly ended it all. When Hogan's wife falsely accused Steiner of assault, he could have gone to prison for 15 years. Just imagine, the career, the legacy, the story, all erased by a lie. But cameras caught the truth, and that truth saved him. In the end, the system failed to bury him again. But how many times can a man fight off the machine before it finally wins? And maybe that's the real tragedy of Scott Steiner. He never got the title reigns, he never got the send-off. What he got was silence, no Hall of Fame, no redemption arc, just a legacy built on chaos and conflict. A legacy many feared, but few respected, because they didn't dare understand it. Scott Steiner was more than a wrestler. He was a warning, a reminder that in wrestling, truth-tellers don't always wear suits. Sometimes they wear chains, scream into mics, and chase down legends in the locker room. But here's the question that lingers. If Steiner had played the game, had followed the rules, had smiled at the cameras and kissed the right hands, would he have been remembered as one of the greatest? Or did his refusal to bow down make him exactly what wrestling needed, even if it never wanted him? What do you think? Was Scott Steiner a madman who destroyed opportunities, or a truth-teller crushed by a corrupt system? Let's hear it in the comments.